And I've seen this in people many times, that in the depths of despair, especially when you've been betrayed, for example, and you wander into the wrong subdivision of the underworld, that's something that comes to mind. If you have a very sick child, for example, or maybe your whole family is suffering, as whole families do sometimes, an idea is going to come to you. It's like, good God, who put this mess together? And is it really worth it? Is it really worth the suffering? Suicidal people, they say no. They say, no, enough of this. And you have to be pushed a long way, generally speaking, before you'll actually commit suicide. You have to be in very, very desperate straits. But your answer under those conditions is that being is such that it would be better if it had never been. And that's I think it's a terrible philosophy, I believe, because I think what happens if you act it out is that you make the very things that led you to despair far worse. And I can't see that if it's reasonable to draw a logical conclusion that suffering justifies your desire to make being end, that the answer to that can't be to produce more suffering. That just doesn't make sense. And my observation has been that people who act out the Mephistophelian philosophy inevitably make suffering far worse. And then that raises the other specter of, well, do they want being just to cease, or are they just out for bloody revenge at any cost? And my conclusion has always been is that the mask is, well, being shouldn't exist because it's too terrible, but the true motivation is I'm going to make everyone suffer as much as I possibly can before I say goodbye to this place. And if you read the writings of people like the kids who shot up the Columbine High School, they'll tell you exactly that that's precisely and exactly what they concluded and then acted out. So anyways, but in this, God says that it was good. And I've thought about that a lot. It's like, because the question is something like, well, is something better than nothing? Because that's a really good question, And I thought about two things in relationship to that. And one is, well, maybe it depends on how it is that you are, right? Because it could be that there are ways of being in the world that justify the world. And there are ways of being in the world that make the world unbearable. And I believe that the narrative that runs through the biblical stories is precisely a dialogue between those two types of being. And the optimistic part of the story is that being requires limitation and suffering. There's no escape from that. But there are modes of being that allow that to be perhaps even more than tolerable. Perhaps there are modes of being that allow that to be good. And it's a straight and narrow road. It's a very difficult road to tread. So I think, well, that's possible. I'm not an optimist by nature, but that's one of the things that I've conceptualized and read about that I actually find plausible, because it's certainly the case, everyone knows this, that there are ways that you can act that make things worse. Everyone knows that. And so if that's the case, there has to be the opposite, right? There has to be ways that you could act that make things better, and obviously you can act in ways that make things really way worse. And so the question is, well, are there ways that you can act that make things really much better? And I think that's the question, is can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we have the being that requires limitation and suffering, and also simultaneously transcend that by our mode of being? And I believe that the biblical stories, and perhaps not only the biblical stories, but the biblical stories are one of the human imagination's best attempts to address and answer that question. That's what the entire story is about.